This podcast is brought to you by Meteorate.
Welcome, folks, to podcast number 4 of the Seriously Funny Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Homer Papantonio, and with me is the revered and renowned Dr. Ross Walker, health expert, cardiologist, and all-round affable, charismatic superstar.
All of the above. Absolutely the above.
Ross, how have you been? You been well?
Very well, thank you, my friend. What about you?
Yep. All right. I've got a bit of a dry cough, but hopefully we can get through this. I was going to. Do you know any good doctors? What would they recommend for a dry cough?
You always, with any condition, the most important aspect of any condition is to make a diagnosis. So the typical cause of a dry cough is just you're getting some sort of viral respiratory tract infection. But if people have chronic coughs, there are 3 main categories if there's nothing to find when the doctor examines you or gets a chest x-ray and everything's normal. Number 1 is what we call postnasal drip, which is very common. So if you've got sinus problems, I've got one of the worst sets of sinuses on the planet.
Okay.
What happens is that mucus accumulates in the sinuses and trickles down the back of your throat, hits the larynx and you cough. Another very common cause is undiagnosed asthma. And the third commonest cause is silent reflux. So people get reflux of acid, comes up, hits the back of the throat, and they cough.
Yeah.
But there are other causes, but they're the 3 common ones.
I'm doing a bit of acupressure to relieve it.
Well, I just told you that's the acupressure point. Just there.
Yep. Okay.
Right, yep.
I'll hold on to that. Thanks. So what's the medical news this week, Ross?
Well, this is an interesting one because a lot of people have a sweet tooth. Do you have a sweet tooth, Howard?
Yeah, I do. More salt than sweet, but I don't mind it. And I've got this fallacy. That's maybe a topic for future shows on whether leading a very active lifestyle in terms of training and everything, whether you've got a higher tolerance for sugar. That's another.
I think that's what a lot of high performance athletes would like to believe, and it's complete nonsense.
Okay?
That aside, people with a sweet tooth who know that sugar is bad for them, and sugar is very bad for anybody.
Yep.
And what I call white death. Any form of sugar, and it doesn't have to be the sugar you put in your tea or coffee, anything that's sweet. So sugar, white bread, pasta, potatoes, rice goes straight to the gut and causes all sorts of issues. So people say, what I'll do is I'll go to the artificial sweeteners because they're better for me. Complete and utter nonsense. I remember a mate of mine who's in his 70s now, and he's quite obese. Quite obese, in fact. When we were training together, he was the surgical registrar, I was the medical registrar. He would have a custard tart for lunch and balance it out with a Diet Coke, which just did my head in.
How do GPs get any form of respect from patients, especially if they're telling them to lose weight and they're morbidly obese like that? Hey?
I think you do have to walk the talk if you're giving people advice along those lines. Look, I don't preach ridiculous thinness. And there's a really interesting topic for a full podcast is what I call the obesity paradox, and we'll do that at some stage.
I've heard of that.
But it's a really interesting topic, but we'll talk about the details of that. But still, I think that if you're in the health professions, you should be really doing your best to maintain a good level of fitness, practice the 5 keys that we spoke about last week. But anyhow, artificial sweeteners. Are artificial sweeteners good for you or are they bad for you? Well, let's look at this recent study. This particular study looked at xylitol levels in 3,000 older people, and they found that those people who had the highest levels of xylitol had a much higher rate of cardiovascular disease. Then they found out why. The reason why they did is because xylitol and erythritol, 2 commonly used sweeteners, artificial sweeteners, thicken the platelets, which are the little sticky elements that make blood clots. So what this is saying is when people think, it's better for me to have an artificially sweetened drink, or to use artificial sweeteners in my tea or coffee than it is to use sugar? No, it's better to do neither. Get out of the habit of putting sugar or artificial sweeteners in your tea or coffee or in anything, or in having foods that have got a lot of these artificial sweeteners in them. They're bad for you.
Yeah, but if you had a cup of tea with sugar in it, a lot of sugar, or a can of Coke, a Diet Coke, which one would you think would be better for you? Because there's an old adage, don't eat anything or drink anything you can't pronounce. And there's a lot of those words in the Diet Coke, like all the ingredients. Have you tried reading them? I remember sitting in business class on a Qantas plane, ordering a tomato juice, reading the can, and there was no tomatoes on the ingredients in the drink.
Yeah, look. The point about this, you say which is better for you. Neither of them are good for you. Do neither.
Or the least.
Either or. Would you prefer to have your right foot removed or your left little finger? I'd prefer neither. Thank you, neither. So let's move on to future of medicine. And I think this is a huge deal. It's what I call micro-patch therapy. Now, you probably don't realise this, but during the pandemic, everyone's being vaccinated by injection into the arm. But in fact, micro-patch vaccinations are actually better for you. You get a better response than you do from an injection because the immune system is much stronger just under the skin than it is in your muscles. So a lot of these micropatch therapies have been developed. And interestingly, 10% of people, Homer, are trypanophobes. Do you know what a trypanophobe is?
A fear of trypanos.
No, a fear of needles. And so 10% of people have a definite fear of needles. These micropatches take away that fear. But also there's a lot of treatments now that are daily or weekly injections. Imagine just putting a patch on your arm. I'll give you just one great example.
Yep.
There are two labs, one in South Korea, I'll stress the word South Korea, the other one in North Carolina, who've developed this graphene patch that you put on your arm. It measures your blood sugar level in real time and delivers insulin based on your blood sugar level and speaks to your mobile phone. So can you imagine diabetes being a completely non-invasive disease that you manage by once a week putting a patch on your arm? I mean, it's quite extraordinary. Now you can have the Libra freestyle monitors where you put this patch on your arm for 2 weeks. They're available now on the PBS scheme for diabetics for people who are getting insulin. But I'm saying, imagine the entire management of your diabetes just being from a patch on your arm.
That's
where
amazing.
You're involved with check the sugar on your phone. I mean, it's just quite extraordinary. That's micropatch therapy. It's on the way. At the moment, it's enormously expensive. But like with every technology, the more it's used, the more the price will come down. Let's move on to body of evidence.
Yes.
And we mentioned last week how really 90% of diseases have some link to the gut microbiome. Well, this is just one example. They're finding now that Parkinson's disease, think about that one, a brain disease has a link to what's going on in your gut. So we talk about the gut-brain axis, the gut immune system axis, the gut-lung axis, the gut-heart axis, because we need healthy gut bacteria to feed into our system. So I'll give you an example. People who've had their appendix removed before age 20 have a higher rate of Parkinson's disease, as one example. But there are particular bugs, one bug called desulfovibrio, which has been found in high concentrations in the colons of people with Parkinson's disease. And interestingly, constipation is a symptom that happens often long before the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. So if people have really significant constipation, they should probably have a bit of a check for this as well. And we're getting better management of Parkinson's disease. The earlier it's recognised, the earlier treatment. And they've done a study overseas where they found this desulfovibrio bacteria and treated particular animals who had this and were getting genetically primed to getting Parkinson's disease. When they treated them with certain antibiotics, that killed off the bacteria, their Parkinson's symptoms and signs got better. So it's just an interesting association there, body of evidence, gut microbes and the link to Parkinson's.
So what's the best diet for gut bacteria? I mean, we know the...
Easy, mate. It's the best diet for everything. Should be a plant-based diet. You have 2 or 3 pieces of fruit per day, 3 to 5 servings of vegetables, but a serving's about a half a carrot, so it's not a huge amount of vegetables. But people who have that amount of fruit and vegetables have the lowest rates of heart disease and cancer in the community, and tragically, less than 10% of people do that. It's a very simple thing to do. It's one of the greatest health innovations possible. 2 or 3 pieces of fruit, 3 to 5 servings of vegetables.
What about yogurt? Yogurt?
Yeah, the yogurt's fine, but I'm saying mainly plant-based food.
Okay.
We'll talk about nutrition another time.
Yep.
But that's just to give you the body of evidence for this week. So the thought of the week.
Yep.
A lot of people, did you know, so this is a did you know thought, Hammer. Did you know that 70% of heart disease is related to the gene for insulin resistance? Now, the gene for insulin resistance is the gene that sets you up for diabetes, type 2 diabetes, blood pressure, cholesterol abnormalities with high triglyceride, low HDL, fat around the belly, and all the things that go with that. And we'll talk more about that in another podcast. But that's 70% of heart disease is due to that gene, and 30% of Caucasians, 50% of Asians, and close to 100% of people with dark or olive skin are born with the gene for insulin resistance. Okay.
So why is that? Why is that? Why is it so prevalent with the dark tinted folk
people
like
with
myself?
darker olive skin are better hunter-gatherers than the rest of us.
Yeah. Okay.
And
so
again,
it's related. It gets back to exercise, lifestyle.
It gets back to where you're genetically primed from. But we'll talk more about that in another podcast. So let's now move on to today's topic.
Okay. So, Ross, I'm going to preface quite nicely the upcoming segment on hallmarks of aging by asking you just to imagine for a moment that I'm delivering the keynote address at your 70th birthday party, which is a fair way away. Is that right?
Oh, years and years, too.
So it would go, and it'd go something like this. Ross, us Greeks say that wisdom begins at 70. It's a time when you wonder how you could be over the hill when you don't even remember being on top of it. Ross, turning 70 years of age is 3/4 of a century. Sounds huge, doesn't it? It is the luxury of youth, the gift you are granted when your likely future still exceeds your past. At 20, you can't imagine what it's like to be 70. The joke you discover is that at 70, you are still none the wiser. Do you realise the only time in our lives when we like to get old is when we're kids? If you're less than 10 years old, you're so excited about aging that you think in fractions. How old are you? Well, I'm 4.5. You're never 64.5. You're 4.5 going on 5. That's the key. You get into your teens, now they can't hold you back. You jump to the next number or even a few ahead. How old are you? I'm going to be 16. You could be 13, but hey, you're going to be 16. And then comes the greatest day of your life. You become 21. Even the words sound like a ceremony. You become frickin' 21. But then turn 30. Oh, what happened there makes you sound like bad milk. He turned 30. We had to throw him out. There's no fun now. You're just a stale bottle of piss. Sorry, you're right. What's wrong? What's changed? You become 21, you turn 30, and you're pushing 40. Whoa, put on the brake. It's all slipping away. Before you know it, Ross, you've got a bit of a big gut, fat bum, and you reach 50, and your dreams are almost gone. But wait, Ross, you make it to 70. All your Christmases have come at once. You didn't think you would till you become 21, turn 30, push 40, reach 50, and make it to 70. Anyway, let's face it, Ross, At 70, everything starts to wear out, fall out, spread out. It's the age when you have stopped growing at both ends and have begun to grow in the middle. And Ross, don't worry about avoiding temptation. It's an age when you can probably live without sex, but not without glasses. When an obscene phone call makes you chuckle, when getting a little action means you need to take a laxative, when getting lucky means remembering where you parked your car. Turning 70 is a time when you are declined as an organ donor because they're not sure if your organs are functional. You discover the meaning of life, but forget to write it down. But that's it. And the twinkle in your eye is merely a reflection from the sun on your cataracts. And it takes twice as long to look half as good. There's a whole heap of age jokes, but let's get into it. The hallmarks of aging, Ross, what are they?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Woody Allen once said, "I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens."
Yes.
And they did a study on a bunch of 20-year-olds and said, "How long do you want to live for?" And they said, 70 will do me. Then they did a study on a bunch of 79-year-olds, and you can imagine what they said. So the problem is that the peak of life, the peak is actually 30, and it's all downhill from there. You hit 50 and the hormones go south. It goes downhill even quicker. So why does that happen? It happens because physiologically we have evolved to really only live 30, 40 years wandering around a jungle with a spear.
Yes.
So when we get beyond our use by date, things start to wear out. And there are a few theories about why we age, and I'm not going to go into those really today, but I just want to talk about what I call the 5 key hallmarks of aging. Some people say there's 9, some people say there's 10, but I like everything in 5s. Why do I like things in 5s? Because I think I said it last week that there are 5 digits on your hand, there are 5 senses, there are 5 seasons if you count Frankie Valley. So everything's in 5s.
Sure.
So let's now go through these. Number 1 is what happens with your DNA. So you don't have to be a scientist to understand that DNA is the basic blueprint of life. And DNA really is given far too much power because we're not the victims of our genes, we're the masters of our genes. But still, as you get older, you get more damage to your DNA, more mutations, more breakages in the DNA. So, for example, if you're foolish enough to smoke, every time you smoke, you induce a mutation in your DNA. So if you have 20 cigarettes a day over 20 years, you get up to about 20,000 cigarettes. There's about 20,000 mutations, and that's where the cancers start. Because the DNA damage is accumulating, you get the damage from the sun, damage from synthetic chemicals, damage from background radiation. There's a lot of things that damage DNA. So that's number 1. And the interesting, there's a group of chemicals called sirtuins that are DNA repairers. And one of the main ingredients there is good old resveratrol. And resveratrol has been studied by Professor David Sinclair, who's really the world anti-aging guru, who grew up just around the corner from where I'm doing this podcast. Right. But he's now Professor of Anti-Aging at Harvard University. And he's done a lot of work on sirtuins and resveratrol. So we're not going to go into all of these details. I'm just giving you a quick overview about the hallmarks. The second part of the DNA damage is damage to your telomeres. Now, the telomeres are the little caps like the little caps on the end of your shoelaces. And these are little caps on the end of DNA. So every time, say, for example, a stem cell's given the signal it's got to make more cells. So what happens, say, in your skin, your stem cells every 30 days turn over and you make new skin. So the stem cells in the skin get a signal, time to make new skin. So one stem cell divides into 2 cells where it becomes another stem cell so it can keep making skin, but the cell it divides into, the daughter cell, becomes skin.
Yeah.
But when that happens, the DNA has to split apart and come back together again. And so, for example, any of these high-performance tennis players, Federer, Djokovic, and any of those guys, they can hit the ball anywhere on the court they want to, but sometimes they hit the net and sometimes the ball goes out. Again, your DNA unravels. Usually it comes back together perfectly, but sometimes it doesn't come back properly, and that's what a mutation is. And that gets more and more and more as you get older, and your telomeres every time shrink. So reduction in telomere length is an indication of aging, and the more your telomeres are short, the more diseases you get. And the DNA initially when you're younger is really tight and bound together and moves in a very, very regulated fashion. As you get older, the telomeres shrink a bit, the DNA gets more floppy, and it just doesn't work as well.
So size does matter with telomeres? Like
oh yeah, the bigger the better. The bigger the better. And
so exercise helps it, and diets.
Yeah, exercise, diet, a whole lot of polyphenols, a whole lot of things help that. And I must give a acknowledgement here of the wonderful Professor Elizabeth Blackburn, a Tasmanian who won the Nobel Prize for inventing telomerase, which adds more length to your telomeres. So it's just that one. Amazing. And there are some companies marketing stuff that promote telomerase. We're not sure whether those things actually do give you longevity, but there's a lot of work going on. It work all around the world in these aging hallmarks. The next part of the DNA issue is what we call epigenetics. So epigenetics, the effect of your environment on your DNA. And there's a thing many people have heard of now called methylation. 50% of the population, and I'm one of them, have a mutation in what's called the MTHFR gene, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. And if you've got a mutation in this gene and you don't treat it properly, then it can cause, as you get older, heart disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, some cancers as well. And if you're younger and you've got this defect, it can actually increase your risk for infertility when you get beyond about 35. So there are very good treatments that you can use to improve your methylation. Another aspect of epigenetics is what we call acetylation. Another aspect is these microRNAs that can affect this epigenetic marks that you get on your DNA. So basically, if you think about your DNA as the blueprint, the epigenetic marks, the methylation marks, the acetylation marks, the microRNAs are like little tags that get onto your DNA, like little barnacles that have to be washed off with the right sort of therapy. So that's number one, DNA damage.
So just on methylation, how do we that's not a good thing, methylation. No,
well,
so
it's not that simple. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, because basically, and this is too basic, methylation switches off genes. So you need methylation, for example, because in every cell, the DNA is the same. But when it's a liver cell, you don't want to have the DNA for teeth because you don't want to grow teeth out of your liver. So the cells for teeth are suppressed by methylation. So that's a good thing. But there are other times when methylation is a bad thing. And so too many genes are switched off as you get older and they're not doing their job properly. So you need to have your methylation regulated. And I think that's another topic for another podcast, too detailed, because I've got all the keys to that. But I'll just whet people's appetite. We can talk about that on another occasion. So I'll just remind myself, methylation is something we should really go into in a much bigger way. So that's DNA, number one. Number two is proteins. So proteins are basically the building blocks of life. And it's been estimated we've got about 150,000 proteins in our body. Now, one of the things that happens is the body's very clever. So you look at now what's happened in the world. We try to recycle stuff so we don't waste it. The body's been doing that forever. So there's a process called autophagy where proteins are used and used and used. So say, for example, a red cell lasts for 3 months. The hemoglobin, which is the thing in the red cell that carries oxygen, after a while that starts to break down. So the bits that are broken down by this process, autophagy, are recycled back to make other proteins elsewhere.
Yeah.
So that's good. But as you get older, your autophagy doesn't work as well, so you're not breaking the proteins down as well. Here's another thing. Proteins aren't these long strips of things. They're these proteins that are folded into different ways so that they do their job. So if you imagine cogs on a wheel, the cogs have to link in together and do their stuff. In the same way, as you get older, those proteins can become what we call misfolded. So every time you have a thought, an emotion, your heart contracts, your muscles contract or whatever, there's a waste product created. And often these waste products then tangle up into these misfolded proteins that have to be eliminated from the body.
So is that dietary protein you're talking about?
I don't know. I'm talking about no, not at all. Not in the slightest. I'm talking about the proteins that have been created in your body by the protein you might swallow and is converted into what we call amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein.
So you get that from an ingestion of protein.
Sort of, but the liver is again another topic for another podcast. But the liver is basically the major factory in the body that takes all the raw materials from your diet and creates proteins.
Yeah.
So you've heard of albumin. Everyone's heard of albumin. Albumin is a major protein that carries stuff around the body. So without albumin, you're not taking a protein from the liver to your foot or to the liver to your brain or whatever. So we need proteins. But if those proteins get misfolded, they become what we call amyloid proteins, and they can get stuck in things like the brain, thus Alzheimer's disease. In the heart, you get amyloid heart disease. In the kidneys, in the liver, all sorts of things can go wrong with amyloid proteins.
Amazing.
And then finally, there's what we call the adducts, or here's the problem. We were designed to be hunter-gatherers, but if you take too much nutrition, then the excessive sugars that might be spilling into your bloodstream then also link with proteins and fat to become these things called advanced glycosylated end products that end up as little toffee apples in the walls of your arteries or in the brain or whatever. So advanced glycosylated end products are breakdown products of proteins, not good for you. So that's number 2, hallmark of aging, is something going wrong with the proteins. Number 1, DNA. Number 2, proteins. Number 3 is how your body senses nutrients. And we've got all of these different mechanisms. So, for example, on the surface of every cell, we've got a thing called the insulin receptor that senses nutrients and opens up to allow sugars and fats to get into the cells. When you're insulin resistant, those receptors are jammed, so you've got to force them open with more insulin. So there's a thing called insulin-like growth factor, which is really important in the generation of growth, but then possibly in the generation of cancers as you get older. There's a thing called mTOR, and mTOR is another part. It's the mammalian target of rapamycin. That doesn't matter, but that's also important for regulating metabolism. And then finally, there's a thing called AMP kinase, which is the master metabolic switch. So, for example, to regulate all of these things and have better nutrient sensing, don't take as much food into your body. So calorie restriction to some extent is a really important part of ideal nutrient sensing. The polyphenols or plant chemicals, so the fruits and vegetables we just spoke about, really important for nutrient sensing. And also, we mentioned as well, how healthy is our gut microbiome. Number 3, nutrient sensing.
Ross, would you incorporate fasting with calorie restriction?
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge topic about whether we should fast or whether we should just cut back on our tucker. It doesn't matter. They're all important things to discuss on another occasion. I'm just saying that all of us, or the vast majority of us, eat more food than we actually need to. And that's one of the problems that upsets your nutrient sensing and contributes to the aging process, is that carrying extra weight and affecting those things that I mentioned before. Number 4 is the mitochondria. Now, to explain to people what the mitochondria is, I'll make an analogy here. It doesn't matter what sort of car you drive. If you don't have an energy source, the car doesn't move. You either have to have a petrol-based car or a hybrid car or an electric car or maybe even a hydrogen-based car. It doesn't matter, but you've got to have a fuel source or an energy source in the body. And we get the energy in our body from the mitochondria. The mitochondria makes a thing called ATP, which is the unit of energy in the body. As we get older, these mitochondria start to dysfunction for all the reasons we're talking about now, and we've got to maintain a good energy source in our body. And there are 3 key things there as far as maintaining the energy source. One is activated versions of B3, so things like NMN, nicotinic acid, NAD riboside, And the other one is the active version of coenzyme Q10, otherwise known as ubiquinol, not ubiquinone. So ubiquinol.
Is there a thin line between those two?
Oh,
Because
yeah,
doesn't
there is
one-
a thin line. You should not take ubiquinone, coenzyme Q10, because when you hit 50, the enzyme diapherase that converts ubiquinone to ubiquinol starts to drop off. So I say to people, don't bother with that one. Just go straight to the source, which is ubiquinol. And I take every day 150 milligrams of ubiquinol just to give me energy. If you're on a statin, that depletes coenzyme Q10 in your body. So you take 150 milligrams there. If you've got heart failure, which means your heart stopped pumping enough blood around the body, you take 300 milligrams a day of ubiquinol. And then finally, for energy production, a thing called magnesium orotate and magnesium aspartate lifts up the CoQ10 in the mitochondria as well. That's number 4, and mitochondrial energy. The final hallmark of aging is pretty obvious. It's called aging. So it's aging cells. It's your cells getting older. So there's a thing we call cellular senescence. So imagine it like this, Homer. This is the best way to make the analogy. You got a group of people going on a walk. You got a bunch of people in their 80s down to a bunch of people in their 20s. What's going to obviously happen there? The 80-year-olds are going to hold up the 20-year-olds. So as we get older, we make more senescent cells. And those senescent cells are holding up the normal cells, but also stealing nutrients from the normal cells and creating more inflammation in the body. And so now we have drugs called and supplements called senolytics that break down those aging cells, get them out of the picture so the younger cells can do their job. Also, as your stem cells get older, they get more exhausted. So, for example, Dolly the sheep was cloned from a 6-year-old sheep's DNA or DNA cells, stem cells. And basically, as soon as Dolly was born, Dolly had already DNA that was aging. So when you've got stem cells that are getting older, they get exhausted, they don't divide and work as well. And that's why no one at 80 looks as good as they did when they were 60. No one at 60 looks as good as they did when they were 40, and no one at 40 looks as good as they did when they were 20, because 30 is the peak of our life.
So exercise does strengthen stem cells.
Of course it does.
So on a Thursday, I go out with world champions, about 14 riders. They're all world champions in their age group over 50. And there's an 80-year-old there that's absolutely amazing. He can keep up with us, and he's great. And you wonder what's happened to as a result of the prodigious amount of riding that he does, the intensity of it, that makes him keep up with the younger mob.
Yeah,
So that's
part of that.
So is the exercise strengthening the stem cells there?
Well, it's strengthening his muscles, his cardiovascular system, all of the stem cells involved with all of those things are keeping him healthy. And then going with that, I've already alluded to it, is what we call inflammaging. So as we get older, we have more inflammatory stuff going on in our bodies. And we have this situation of chronic inflammation where the immune system is really having to work hard to get rid of all the accumulated junk over the years. And so this inflammation, it's a bit like a corrupt policeman. It becomes part of the problem rather than fixing the problem.
Yeah, but all diseases are inflammation, aren't they?
All diseases have inflammation as part of their mechanism. So every disease is due to something that shouldn't be there in the first place. So in cardiology, small, dense LDL cholesterol, I mentioned that in the first podcast, small, dense LDL cholesterol passes across the wall of the artery, into the artery, set up a fatty plaque. The immune system comes along, the macrophages come from the immune system, cross across and say, hey, that thing shouldn't be there, the LDL, small, dense LDL, and they engulf it and start chewing on it. But like human beings, the white cells like fat, and they chew on this fat and they become fat themselves. We call that follicles. And they get fatter and fatter and then rupture and cause a fatty plaque. And so more white cells come in and do the same thing. It becomes a vicious circle of chronic inflammation. And then finally, the last bit is what we call cell-to-cell communication. And when you have poor cell-to-cell communication, everything breaks down. People aren't talking to each other. The cells aren't talking to each other. And the final part of all of this, which goes with aging cells, is what we call cell-to-cell communication. So basically, the cells don't talk to each other, and for any community to function well, you need good communication throughout that. And just like everything else breaks down, if you imagine a cell, on that cell are all these little antennae like receptors that are taking in messages from everywhere, from different parts of the body, coming in, saying we need this nutrient in this cell. And so all these things are talking to each other. As we get older, we lose that cell-to-cell communication. So to summarize, the 5 hallmarks of aging: problems with DNA, problems with protein, problems with nutrient sensing, problems with energy production in the mitochondria, and finally the general aging of cells. And those things all contribute to why we get older. And the point is, there's so much work being done all over the world now to try and affect all of these different hallmarks so people can live longer and live better.
So, Ross, is it humans that are trying to solve this whole process of aging?
Yes.
Or are we going to start recruiting biological AI sort of strategies to solve this?
With everything, we use computers now because there are so many reactions that go on in the body that you must use computers and AI to deal with all of these things. So the Human Genome Project, which finished in 2003, or first mapped a DNA molecule in 2003, that took so much computer space. But now, because of improved technology, it's nowhere near as expensive. You can get it done much quicker. And this is what's happening across the board with all of these things, with any aspect of medical research. There's a thing called Moore's Law for computing, where computers double their power every 18 months.
Yeah.
I think the same thing's happening in medical research as well as it is in aging. So they're talking about the potential for a person born today will live to the age of 150. Will that happen? I don't know, but the evidence is showing it's a very good chance it will.
And there are obviously moral and ethical dilemmas to this whole pursuit of longevity.
Yeah, and that's the topic for another podcast. But all I'm doing is, at the moment, presenting the hallmarks of aging, which I think I've done.
Okay. So we'll move on to some questions. And we've got
a couple of questions, Yep.
We've got a lady, Nellie from Melbourne, who's saying that she's been recently diagnosed with osteopenia.
Yep.
So what is that, Ross?
Okay, so that's Dame Nellie from Melbourne. Osteopenia is the precursor step to osteoporosis.
Yeah.
And as we know, osteoporosis is basically weakening in your bones as you get older, which starts at 30. So osteopenia means your bones aren't normal, but they're not at the stage where they're very brittle. But if you don't do something about it, they will get to that stage. So my advice to everybody, and this is will be a constant theme throughout all of these podcasts, and I know with you I'm preaching to the choir, Homer, but the best non-medical management of osteoporosis or osteopenia is a thing called exercise that should be 2/3 cardio and 1/3 resistance training, 3 to 5 hours a week, no doubt.
But it needs to be weight bearing?
Weight bearing, that's the resistance training. Okay, number 2 is don't drink any fizzy drinks, whether they're sugar sweetened or artificially sweetened, because there's a thing called phosphoric acid that rips the calcium out of your bones. Number 3, don't take oral calcium. So oral calcium in the form of calcium carbonate as you're swallowing chalk. And the big study, meta-analysis of 100 papers, asked 2 questions. Does oral calcium prevent osteoporosis? Answer, no. Does it prevent bone fracture? Answer, no. But what it did do was put calcium in the wall of your arteries. So don't take oral calcium. Number 4 is keep your vitamin D levels at around 100. And I believe everyone should be taking 2 vitamin D capsules, 1,000 units every day, and spending a bit of time in the sun in the non-burning times. And number 5, vitamin K2,
Yes.
180 micrograms a day, takes the calcium out of your arteries and puts it back in your bones. So there's 5 things you can do that certainly helps osteopenia. If you get to the point of developing osteoporosis, then I think the best medical therapy is an injection called denosumab, otherwise known as Prolia, every 6 months. And people say, but doctor, I don't want to take a pharmaceutical. Well, the point is pharmaceuticals have very strong effects and some have very strong side effects. But I think of all the treatments we have at the moment for osteoporosis, that Prolia therapy is the best. But there are newer therapies coming through, which as time go on will supplant Prolia. So there you go.
So do you think vitamin K2 is evidence-based as being the traffic cop for the calcium? It is.
Of course. There's a thing called the Rotterdam study, which is a study of around 270 postmenopausal women over 3 years, and showed that the dose I said, 180 micrograms a day, certainly improved arterial flexibility and certainly improved bone strength. So it's harmless. It's I think, very, very good for you. Something I take to keep my bones strong.
We've got a question here from Peter from Brisbane. I'm an athlete. I have a gym instructor who is always telling me to go on the keto diet. He eats meat 3 times a day, virtually no carbs, no fruit, no vegetables, and says that is the secret to strength and longevity.
Mm. Yeah, and if you look out the window, there's a pig flying there as well. Look, can I say to you, firstly, before I answer that question, I just wanted to tell you, because you did make this comment before, but Sister Teresa was known for her very high intelligence. She was the smartest person in the convent. She was also known as none the wiser. And I'd say that Peters would be none the wiser after listening to his gym instructor. Ask the gym. I have a cup that I use on my desk that says, please do not confuse your Google search with my medical degree. Look, let me say, if people want to go into keto for a short period of time to lose weight below the age of 50, I have no problems with that at all for a short period of time. But there is no evidence base about its long-term safety. And in fact, when you look at all the pointers of the long-term safety of consuming diets that I call extreme fad diets, there is a trend towards harm with these diets. Now, I've also seen, and this is anecdotal, this is not a clinical trial, I've seen a small amount of people in my own practice over the age of 50 who wanted to lose weight rapidly. So, because they had big abdominal obesity, losing weight rapidly pours fat into your central circulation. And if you've got high-grade plaque sitting there waiting to rupture, and you pour this extra fat in because you've got on some fad diet, like a keto diet or a paleo diet, I've seen people have heart attacks and strokes go onto these diets. The only diet that has an evidence base is the Mediterranean diet, which is having 2 or 3 pieces of fruit per day, 3 to 5 servings of vegetables, little bits of meat, eggs, dairy, chicken, fish, nuts, olive oil. There's your diet. So please, these diets like keto and paleo, I don't see there's any major place for them. And I've got a subgroup of patients who've got onto these diets where it hasn't seemed to hurt them, but their cholesterol's gone from 4 or 5 up to 10 or 11 or 12. And then not everyone does that, but it does it for some people. So Hippocrates said in his Hippocratic oath, first do no harm.
But it can also be fairly toxic too, can't it? I mean, just eating meat. I have tried it for 2 days, and your body craves for fruit, veggies, a few other carbs, the whole lot.
I would like everyone's body to crave for fruits and vegetables because they're so damn good for you, and that's the point. You see, it's not a lot of people talk about what you shouldn't eat, but I prefer to focus on what you should eat, and the overwhelming evidence for mainly having fruits and vegetables as the key, that's what keeps people healthy. It's not whether they have a bit of meat on top of it. It's the fact they're having the fruit and vegetables.
Yeah, It's amazing how big that whole keto movement is within health clubs and gymnasiums. And they'll say that they're quoting doctors. They're quoting doctors. They're saying it's a conspiracy theory between the whole whatever. And it's an interesting movement, that whole keto movement.
Yeah, but there's a whole lot of people who believe in conspiracy theories, and I don't want to get into that because I don't want to start slagging matches with people. But typically, when you look at them properly, they're nonsense. So,
do you think that as we get older, we do need more protein?
I think what we need as we get at any age is a good, sensible diet, and part of that is getting good quality protein, getting good quality plant chemicals, otherwise known as polyphenols. Very, very good for you.
Okay, that's great. I think we might be coming to the end there, Ross.
We've certainly come to here. Yep.
And if anyone wants to download all the podcasts here, just go to seriouslyfunnywellbeing.com. If you want to email us, please email hello@seriouslyfunnywellbeing or info@seriouslyfunnywellbeing. And we'll see you next week on the Seriously Funny Wellbeing Show. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.